Welcome to the world of knights, just not the one Hollywood sold you. Forget the gleaming armor, the cozy castles, and the true love that always wins in the end. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the gritty, bruised, and often brutal reality of medieval knighthood. A world where tournaments could bankrupt or kill you, castles felt more like damp stone refrigerators, and marriage had more to do with land than love. Before we begin, make sure you're settled in, but maybe not too comfortable, because some of this might sting a little. Hit like and subscribe only if you're into history without the sugarcoating. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, let the night hum in the background, and let's tear into the myths, one layer at a time. Because behind the songs and legends lies a truth that's far messier and far more human. So you think being a knight was all jousting tournaments, rescuing damsels, and looking majestic on horseback with your hair flowing in the wind, huh? Yeah, I thought so too. Thanks, Hollywood. Look, I get it. We've all been fed this romantic image of knighthood since we were kids. Knights in shining armor, noble quests, and heroic deeds that would make even the most cynical person believe in chivalry. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but medieval reality had other plans. Way different plans. Picture this. You're a knight in 12th century England. It's a chilly morning, and you've just woken up in your modest chamber. The first thing on your mind isn't, what damsel shall I rescue today? Or, which dragon needs slaying? No, it's more like, dear God, I hope my squire remembered to oil my armor joints so I don't sound like a walking wind chime. Speaking of armor, let's chat about that shining metal cocoon for a minute. Movie knights prance around in gleaming full-plate armor like it's a comfortable second skin. They do backflips, run marathons, and even have intimate moments without taking off a single piece. In reality, that stuff was a mobile torture chamber. Full-plate armor weighed anywhere from 45 to 80 pounds. Imagine strapping 4 or 5 bowling balls to your body and then trying to go about your day. Not so heroic now, is it? And that shining part? Pure fantasy. Keeping armor polished was an endless, thankless task that would consume hours of your day. Or more likely, your poor squire's day. Most of the time, armor was dirty, scratched, dented, and about as shining as a mud puddle. But knights were expert fighters who moved with grace and precision. I hear you protest. Well, sort of. Knights were trained fighters, yes, but moving with grace. In that armor, the best description would be mobile with limitations. You couldn't scratch your nose without assistance. Mounting your horse required a small team of people or a crane-like contraption. If you fell off your horse, which happened way more often than the movies suggest, you'd need help getting up, like a turtle stuck on its back. Oh, and don't get me started on the whole armor sealed so tight not a drop of water could get in. Myth. Your armor had gaps, necessary gaps, because, humans need to move their joints and stuff. These gaps were covered by chainmail or leather, but they were still vulnerable spots. And when it rained, you became a walking bathtub, with water seeping in through every nook and cranny, soaking your gambeson. That's the padded jacket you wore under your armor, making it weigh even more and smell like wet dog. But here's a fun fact that movies never show you. Bathroom breaks. Yeah, knights had bodily functions too. Shocking, I know. When nature called during battle, and it always seemed to call at the most inconvenient times, you had limited options. Sometimes you just went. Right there in your armor. The gambeson would absorb most of it, which is yet another reason why being a squire responsible for cleaning a knight's equipment was arguably worse than being the knight himself. As the morning sun rises higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the castle walls, you stand there in your not-so-shining armor, already sweating bullets despite the cool air. Your squire is making final adjustments, tightening straps that dig into your shoulders and pinch at your sides. The weight of tradition and expectation sits on your shoulders just as heavily as the metal plates. Is it supposed to pinch there? You ask for the 100th time. Yes, my lord. Your squire replies, also for the 100th time. That's how we know it's fitted properly. You sigh, already dreaming of the evening when you can take the blasted thing off again. But for now, duty calls. Not glamorous quests or legendary battles, most likely border patrol, settling peasant disputes, or standing around looking important while your lord entertains visitors from neighboring estates. Just another day in the life of a knight. Nothing like the movies at all. All right, let's talk about the typical day-to-day existence of your average knight. Movies would have you believe it was all feasting in great halls, dancing with noble ladies, and idle hours spent practicing swordplay in picturesque courtyards. The reality? Much less Instagram-worthy. For starters, most knights weren't wealthy lords with sprawling estates and armies of servants. The vast majority were what we might call middle management, in today's terms. Professional fighters with some social status, but often struggling to maintain it. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of someone who leases a luxury car they can barely afford to impress the neighbors. A knight needed horses, multiple because these animals died with alarming frequency, armor, astronomically expensive, weapons, servants, and appropriate clothing to maintain appearances. All of this required money, and lots of it. Where did this money come from? Not usually from slaying dragons and collecting reward gold. No, it came from land management, taxation of peasants, and quite often less than heroic activities like raiding, pillaging, or ransoming prisoners. Yes, your movie knight who refuses payment for his noble deeds would have starved to death in about a month in reality. Chivalry might not be dead, but it doesn't pay the bills either. Home sweet home for a knight wasn't typically a castle, by the way. Maybe a fortified manor house if they were doing well. More commonly, it was a modest stone or wooden structure with drafty rooms and minimal furnishings. Indoor plumbing. Please. Your bathroom was a hole in a wooden seat that emptied into a cesspit or moat. Your shower was a bucket of cold water, heated on special occasions if you were lucky. And those feasts we see in the movies? Sure, they happened, but not daily. Medieval gastronomy for even the upper classes was, how should I put this delicately, an acquired taste. Heavily spiced meats, often partly spoiled and disguised by those spices, bread so hard it could chip teeth, and vegetables cooked until they surrendered all flavor and nutritional value. Gourmet it was not. The average knight's diet was protein-heavy when they could get it, consisting of bread, cheese, some form of meat or fish, and ale or wine, often consumed instead of water, as water sources were frequently contaminated. Fruits and fresh vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies were common companions. But what about all that courtly love? You might ask. The poetry, the wooing of ladies, the romantic gestures. Ah, yes, the medieval version of dating. While courtly love did exist as a concept, it was largely an idealized social game rather than genuine romance. Marriage for knights, as for most nobility, was first and foremost a business arrangement. You married to forge alliances, gain land, or increase social standing. Personal feelings rarely entered into it. That's not to say knights never fell in love or engaged in affairs. They absolutely did. But the romanticized version of the knight pining away for his lord's wife, writing her sonnets, and wearing her token into battle? That was literature, not everyday reality. Real knights who overstepped these boundaries often faced severe consequences. Nothing kills romance quite like the threat of being hanged for dishonoring your lord's marriage. Knights were also expected to be literate and cultured, at least by medieval standards. But this wasn't universal. Many knights could barely read or write, focusing instead on the martial skills that kept them alive in battle. The image of the knight reciting poetry 1 minute and expertly wielding a sword the next might apply to some, but was hardly the norm. As the afternoon wears on in our typical knight's day, he might find himself settling disputes among peasants on his small estate. It's tedious work, listening to arguments about stolen chickens or boundary disputes. This is hardly the stuff of epic tales, but it consumed far more of a knight's time than epic quests ever did. But Lars's pig has been digging up my turnips for 3 seasons now, whines a weather-beaten farmer, while another red-faced peasant shouts denials. You sigh, feeling a headache coming on. Your armor chafes at your neck, and your stomach growls. It's been hours since your meager breakfast of hard bread and cheese. The glamorous life of a knight, indeed. Later, as evening approaches, you finally return to your modest hall. Your wife, chosen for her family connections rather than any romantic attachment, is managing the household accounts with a furrowed brow. Children run underfoot, supervised by a harried nursemaid. A lone servant struggles to prepare the evening meal in the smoky kitchen. You remove your sword belt with relief, handing it to your weary squire. Tomorrow will bring more of the same: administrative duties, training, maintenance of equipment, perhaps some hunting if you're lucky. No dragons, no damsels in towers, no holy grails. Just the unglamorous reality of being a professional warrior in a world where survival itself was often achievement enough. Ah, knightly training. The movies give us these wonderful montages, a young, eager squire being transformed into a skilled warrior through a series of challenging but ultimately rewarding exercises, all set to inspiring music. After a few minutes of screen time, voila, a master swordsman is born, if only. In reality, training to become a knight was a brutal, decades-long process that began in childhood and never truly ended. And it wasn't just about learning to swing a sword dramatically while maintaining perfect hair. The journey typically began around age 7, when a boy would be sent away from home to serve as a page in another lord's household. Yes, 7 years old. Basically a second grader. Imagine sending your Nintendo-loving kid off to live with strangers and begin training for a life-or-death profession. Not exactly heartwarming. As a page, the child would learn basic skills: how to serve at table, proper etiquette, horsemanship, and the fundamentals of combat. This wasn't play fighting with foam swords. It was hard, physical training with wooden weapons that left bruises, broken bones, and occasionally took lives. Children died during training with alarming frequency, accepted as simply part of the process. Around age 14, if the boy survived and showed promise, he would become a squire. Now the real fun began. A squire was essentially a knight's personal assistant, responsible for everything from maintaining his armor and weapons to dressing him, feeding him, and yes, even helping him use the bathroom when in full armor. Glamorous. Training intensified during these years. Squires learned to fight while wearing increasingly heavy armor, to ride a horse in combat conditions, to use various weapons effectively, and to survive the chaos of battle. This wasn't about looking cool, it was about staying alive. And it hurt. A lot. Training injuries were constant. Broken fingers, dislocated shoulders, concussions, all just part of the daily routine. Modern athletes with their ice baths and physical therapists would weep at the lack of recovery protocols. Got a broken rib? Wrap it up and get back out there. Your lord needs his armor polished. But what about all those impressive sword moves, I hear you ask? Well, real medieval combat was less about flashy spins and more about brutal efficiency. The goal wasn't to look good, it was to not die. Sometimes that meant using your sword like a baseball bat, or even turning it around to use the pommel as a bludgeon. Effective, yes. Cinematic, no. One of the most grueling aspects of training was building the necessary physical endurance. Knights needed to be able to fight while wearing up to 80 pounds of armor, often in extreme heat. To prepare for this, squires would train while wearing progressively heavier gear, sometimes even sleeping in partial armor to acclimate their bodies. Imagine doing push-ups while wearing a backpack filled with bricks. Now imagine doing that for hours, every day for years. Now add running, climbing, and getting hit with blunt objects. Starting to get the picture? And horseback riding? Don't get me started. Movie knights leap gracefully onto their steeds with one fluid motion. Real medieval knights often needed mounting blocks or assistance from squires. The horses themselves weren't the majestic, perfectly groomed creatures we see on screen either. They were smaller, sturdier animals, bred for carrying heavy loads and withstanding the chaos of battle. Learning to fight effectively from horseback took years to master. You try coordinating a 1,000-pound animal with your legs while simultaneously swinging a weapon and not falling off. All while wearing what amounts to a metal coffin. Not as easy as it looks in that 2-minute training montage, is it? By the time a squire reached his late teens or early 20s, assuming he survived that long, he might be considered ready for knighthood. This wasn't guaranteed. Many served as squires their entire lives, never quite making the cut or lacking the resources necessary to become a full knight. The dubbing ceremony itself was often less dramatic than portrayed in film. While some were elaborate affairs with religious elements, others were expedited, especially before battles. A quick sword tap on the shoulders, a few solemn words, and congratulations. You're now qualified to die in slightly more prestigious circumstances. Rise a knight, your lord says after tapping your shoulders with his sword. You stand, your knees aching from kneeling on the stone floor, your back sore from years of training abuse. You've achieved your life's goal, and your reward is more of the same, but with higher expectations and expenses. The sun is setting now as you finish yet another grueling training session with your own squire. Your body is a map of old injuries, the shoulder that never quite healed right, the knee that predicts rain better than any astrologer, the fingers that don't straighten anymore. You're not yet 40, but you feel ancient. Your squire hands you a cloth to wipe the sweat from your face. Will I ever be as good as you, sir? He asks, eyes wide with the same naive admiration you once had. You look at him, really look at him, seeing the bruises, the exhaustion, the youthful hope that hasn't yet been beaten out of him. Should you tell him the truth? That the glory is mostly imagined? That the songs omit the pain, the tedium, the constant fear? Keep practicing your footwork, you say instead. And remember, in a real fight, there's no shame in aiming for the joints in the armor. Honor is for tournaments and tales. Training never stops. Even as a full knight, you must maintain your skills, adapt to new weapons and tactics, and keep your aging body battle-ready. There are no retirement plans for knights who can no longer lift their swords. This is the reality of knightly training. A lifelong commitment to violence that began in childhood and ended, often prematurely, on some forgotten battlefield. No montages, no triumphant musical crescendos, just years of pain, punctuated by brief moments of survival. Not exactly the stuff of summer blockbusters, is it? All right, here we go. The centerpiece of any good knight movie, the battle scene. You know the one. Our hero knight charges gloriously across an open field, his armor gleaming in the sunlight, sword raised high. He cuts through enemies like they're made of paper, barely breaking a sweat. There's dramatic music, meaningful eye contact with the opposing champion, and inevitably a one-on-one duel that decides the fate of kingdoms. Yeah, no. Real medieval battles were less choreographed dance of destiny, and more chaotic nightmare of confusion and terror. Let's break down what actually happened when knights went to war. First off, knights didn't usually fight other knights right away. Why? Because knights were valuable, both as fighters and potential ransom material. Instead, the opening phases of battle typically involved foot soldiers and archers doing the dirty work. Knights were a medieval investment. You didn't risk them unless necessary. When knights did engage, it wasn't with those elegant, spacious one-on-one duels we see in movies. Real medieval combat was crowded, messy, and brutal. Imagine being in a mosh pit where everyone is wearing metal and trying to kill each other. There's no room for fancy spins or acrobatics, just desperate hacking, pushing, and trying to stay upright. But what about all those amazing sword fights that last for minutes on end? Sorry to disappoint, but real medieval combat engagements were shockingly brief. Most sword exchanges lasted seconds, not minutes. A typical fight between armored opponents wasn't about slicing through armor, which rarely worked, but finding gaps or weaknesses, or simply exhausting your opponent until they made a fatal mistake. Often knights didn't even use swords as their primary weapon. On horseback, the lance reigned supreme. On foot, polearms like halberds or war hammers were far more effective against armored opponents than swords. A good hammer could dent armor, transferring the force to the unfortunate person inside. Swords were more like sidearms, useful, but not always the go-to choice. And forget about those dramatic death scenes where the hero is stabbed, but manages to deliver a poignant final speech before gracefully collapsing. Real battlefield deaths were ugly. Penetrating wounds led to rapid blood loss, punctured organs, or infection. Many knights didn't die from the initial injury, but from subsequent infection or blood poisoning days or weeks later. Medieval medicine consisted primarily of prayers, herbal poultices of questionable efficacy, and if you were really unlucky, amputation without anesthesia. Speaking of injuries, getting wounded didn't make you more determined and heroic. It made you slower and more likely to die. There was no fighting through the pain to save the day. Once seriously injured, your battle was effectively over, and your primary concern became avoiding being finished off or captured. The battlefield itself bore little resemblance to the cinematic version. Movies show relatively clean fields with clearly defined battle lines. Reality? Imagine a churned-up mud pit filled with bodily fluids, severed limbs, and the bodies of the fallen, both human and equine. The smells alone would be enough to make a modern person vomit. Blood, excrement, fierce sweat, and the beginnings of decomposition under the hot sun. Communication during battle was another major difference. Movie battles feature clear commands being shouted and perfectly executed maneuvers. In reality, once the fighting started, it was nearly impossible to coordinate effectively. The noise was deafening. Thousands of metal objects striking other metal objects, screaming men and horses, the constant roar of chaos. Hand signals and banner movements helped somewhat, but battles often devolved into fragmented, localized skirmishes with little overall coordination. Let's talk about horses in battle. War horses were valuable, trained assets, not disposable vehicles. Movies show horses being slashed and continuing to run perfectly. In reality, injured horses panicked, threw riders, trampled allies, and created chaos. A knight unseated was a knight in serious trouble, suddenly finding himself on foot in armor designed primarily for mounted combat. Weather conditions dramatically affected battles in ways movies rarely show. Fighting in the rain. Your visibility is compromised, the ground is slippery, and your armor is now even heavier as it soaks up water. Extreme heat? You might literally cook inside your armor or pass out from heat exhaustion before even engaging the enemy. Perhaps the biggest myth is the idea that battles were somehow fair or governed by strict codes of chivalry. While certain rules existed, particularly for formal tournaments, actual warfare was about winning, not playing nice. Ambushes, deception, attacking from behind, all fair game if it meant victory and survival. The aftermath of battle was equally unglamorous. No triumphant marches home immediately after victory. Instead, The survivors spent hours or days recovering bodies, tending to wounded comrades, and often dealing with disease that spread rapidly among weakened, densely packed groups of men. "Hold the line!" bellows a commander somewhere in the confusion ahead of you. You can barely hear him over the cacophony of battle. Your helmet restricts your vision to a narrow slit, giving you tunnel vision. You've lost track of your banner, your comrades, even which direction you're facing. Your arm burns with fatigue from the weight of your shield. Each breath inside your helmet is hot and labored. You stepped in something soft moments ago and don't want to know what or who it was. A man appears before you, his surcoat so covered in mud and blood that you can't tell if he's friend or foe. You hesitate, a potentially fatal mistake, before recognizing an emblem on his damaged shield. An ally. He nods, equally exhausted, before being swallowed by the crowd of fighting men. This is the true face of battle for a knight. Confusion, exhaustion, and terror, with brief moments of desperate violence. No glory, no perfectly executed sword techniques, no witty banter with enemies. Just survival, minute by minute, in conditions so horrific that many never fully recovered from the psychological trauma. Hours later, the fighting finally subsides. You've survived. This time. Around you lie the dead and dying, their groans forming a grim chorus as the sun sets on the battlefield. Your squire helps remove your helmet. The sudden rush of fresh air makes you dizzy. "We won, sir," he says, though there's no joy in his voice. Victory or defeat. The aftermath looks much the same from where you stand. This is what being a knight in battle really meant. Not the glorious, choreographed spectacle we see in movies, but a terrifying ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance, both physical and mental. Those who romanticize medieval combat have clearly never worn 60 pounds of metal while someone tried earnestly to end their life with a spiked hammer. So, you've survived a battle. Congratulations. Maybe you took a wound or two, but nothing fatal. In the movies, this is where a beautiful woman tenderly cleans your wounds, perhaps applying some magical healing herb while meaningful glances are exchanged. You'll be back on your feet by the next scene, perhaps with a fashionable scar to show for your troubles. The reality of medieval medicine makes that battle you just survived look almost pleasant by comparison. Let's say you've taken a sword slash to your arm, right through that gap in your armor at the elbow joint. It's a common enough injury. In a movie, it's a flesh wound, barely worth mentioning. In medieval reality, this could very well kill you, just more slowly and painfully than if you'd taken a direct hit to the head. First, there's the immediate treatment. Forget sterile environments and anesthesia. Your wound would be examined by a barber surgeon. Yes, the same guy who cuts hair and pulls teeth also handled battle wounds. His medical training? Largely based on theories about humoral imbalances and apprenticeship learning, not actual anatomy or germ theory. The wound cleaning process would involve wine, if you were lucky, or vinegar, if you weren't, poured directly into the open cut. Feel free to scream, everyone else did. Next might come cauterization, literally burning the wound closed with a red-hot iron. Again, no anesthesia beyond maybe some strong alcohol if you were fortunate. The smell of your own burning flesh would be something you'd never forget if you survived. If the wound was particularly deep or messy, stitching might be necessary. Suture material wasn't the sterile, purpose-made stuff of modern medicine. It could be anything from animal sinew to human hair to plant fibers. Needles were reused without sterilization. Each stitch was an invitation for infection to enter your body. After the initial treatment came the real danger: infection. Without antibiotics or proper understanding of germs, wound infections were incredibly common and frequently fatal. Red streaks moving up your arm from the wound site. That's blood poisoning setting in. The medieval solution often involved bleeding you to release the bad humors. Yes, removing more blood from someone already weakened by blood loss and trauma. If gangrene developed, recognizable by the blackening dead tissue and distinctive smell, amputation might be your only hope for survival. This procedure was performed with saws and knives, sometimes after numbing the area with cold water or a tight tourniquet, but often with the patient fully conscious. Speed was considered the best approach. A skilled surgeon would remove a limb in under a minute to minimize the patient's suffering. The mortality rate for amputations? Astronomical by today's standards. Between blood loss, shock, and post-operative infection, you had maybe a 25% chance of survival. Those who did survive often faced a lifetime of disability in an era with no disability accommodations, limited prosthetic options, and social stigma around physical impairments. But let's say you're extremely lucky and your wound heals without major infection or need for amputation. You're still not out of the woods. Damaged muscles and tendons might never heal properly, leaving you with limited mobility or chronic pain. Bones that broke and healed incorrectly could cause lifelong issues. And the psychological trauma of battle and subsequent medical treatment? That wasn't even recognized as a medical concern. It pains me still when it rains, an older knight tells you as you both watch younger men train in the yard. He flexes his hand, the fingers gnarled and stiff from an old sword wound. 17 years ago, that blow. The wound healed, but the hand never worked right again. You nod, understanding all too well. Your own collection of injuries, the knee that doesn't straighten fully, the shoulder that dislocates during certain movements, the persistent headaches from that mace blow to your helmet, are the true badges of knighthood. Not medals or honors, but a body that betrays you more with each passing year. Even non-battle injuries or common illnesses could prove fatal. Break a leg falling from your horse? That could easily lead to a compound fracture, infection, and death. Fever, dysentery, pneumonia, conditions we treat routinely today, regularly claimed lives in the medieval period, knights not excluded. Dental problems were particularly common and excruciating. Knights weren't exempt from the dental issues plaguing medieval populations, cavities, abscesses, and infections. Dental care consisted primarily of extraction, without anesthesia, of course. Many knights in their 30s or 40s were missing multiple teeth, making eating difficult and contributing to poor nutrition. Mental health, not even considered a medical field. Battle trauma, what we would now recognize as PTSD, was viewed as either a character weakness or, in some cases, a spiritual affliction. There was no treatment beyond perhaps confession to a priest, or drowning the memories in alcohol, a common enough medicine for knights dealing with the psychological aftermath of war. As you lie on your pallet that night, your newly treated wound throbbing with each heartbeat, you wonder if it will be the one that finally takes you. Not in glorious battle as the songs describe, but slowly, painfully as infection sets in over days or weeks. Around you, other wounded men shift and groan, some praying, others cursing as fever takes hold. Your squire approaches with a bowl of thin broth, the only food your stomach might tolerate after the shock of your wound and treatment. "The surgeon says you were fortunate, sir," he says, trying to sound encouraging. He's seen men die from lesser cuts. You manage a weak smile, knowing that fortunate is relative. The pain is your constant companion now, the wound a doorway through which death might still enter despite the barber surgeon's best efforts. This is the reality of medieval medicine for knights. Brutal, primitive, and often more dangerous than the wounds it attempted to treat. The romantic image of the wounded hero who bounces back after a brief recovery montage? Pure fiction. Real medieval knights carried their battle scars for life, often with chronic pain and disability as unwelcome companions until the end. Chivalry. Perhaps the most romanticized aspect of knighthood. Movies present us with knights who live by an unwavering moral code. Protect the innocent, respect women, fight fairly, show mercy to the defeated, and remain loyal to their lord and faith above all else. These knights would rather die than break their code of honor. It makes for a great character arc, but historically, well, let's just say medieval reality was a bit more flexible. The concept of chivalry did exist, yes. There were indeed codes of conduct for knights, some formally written, others understood through cultural norms. But these weren't universal, weren't always followed, and, this is important, were primarily about regulating behavior between knights and other nobles, not about how knights treated common folk. Think of chivalry less as a strict moral code and more as a gentleman's agreement among the warrior elite, a set of professional courtesies extended to equals, not universal human rights to be respected for all. It was essentially a club with rules that applied only to other club members. Let's start with that famous notion of protecting the innocent and defenseless. In reality, common people were often the explicit targets of knightly violence. During warfare, destroying enemy resources, including peasant villages, crops, and livestock, was standard military strategy. Knights routinely participated in these chevauchées, scorched earth raids, burning farms and villages to weaken enemy territories. The people living in those villages? Collateral damage. Their suffering and death wasn't considered a moral failing on the knight's part. It was just how war worked. The famous English longbowmen weren't born with bows in their hands. They became expert archers because a royal decree mandated archery practice instead of other sports. Why? Because their king needed them as military assets. The common people existed to support the nobility, including supplying them with food and military service. What about respecting women? Well, noble women received certain protections and courtesies, at least in theory. But this respect still existed within a profoundly patriarchal system, where women were primarily valued as political assets through marriage alliances or as bearers of heirs. The courtly love tradition, where knights professed devoted love to noble ladies, was largely a social game rather than genuine gender equality. And non-noble women? They enjoyed few protections. During warfare, sexual violence against common women was widespread and rarely punished. Even in peacetime, knights and nobles held significant power over the peasant women on their lands, and abuses were common. Fighting fairly? Another concept that sounds better in movies than it worked in practice. Yes, certain rules existed for formal tournaments and judicial duels. But in actual warfare? The goal was victory, preferably while staying alive. Ambushes, deception, overwhelming force, all were considered perfectly acceptable tactics. The knight who hesitated out of some misplaced sense of fairness was often the knight who didn't survive to fight another day. My grandfather taught me that honor is for tournaments, an old knight tells his squire as they prepare for battle. In war, there is only victory or death. Remember that when the fighting starts. As for showing mercy to defeated enemies, this varied widely depending on circumstances. Noble enemies were often captured rather than killed, not primarily out of mercy, but because ransoming them back to their families was incredibly profitable. It was a business decision more than a moral one. Common soldiers couldn't expect the same treatment. They had no ransom value, and taking prisoners required resources for guarding and feeding them. The practical solution? They were often simply killed, even after surrendering. After the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, Henry V ordered the execution of most of his French prisoners when he feared a fresh attack was imminent. Practical, yes. Chivalrous? Not so much. Loyalty to one's lord was indeed important, but medieval history is filled with knights and nobles changing sides when it benefited them. Oaths were serious business, yes, but they could be renounced under certain circumstances, especially if one could argue their lord had failed in his obligations first. Political pragmatism often trumped idealized notions of undying loyalty. Even religious devotion, supposedly a cornerstone of knightly virtue, was more complicated in practice than in Hollywood portrayal. While many knights were genuinely devout, others paid lip service to religious ideals while behaving in decidedly un-Christian ways. The Crusades, often portrayed as the pinnacle of knightly religious devotion, saw supposedly Christian knights engaging in looting, massacre, and other atrocities that directly contradicted Christian teachings. This isn't to say that all knights were amoral opportunists. Individual knights certainly varied in their personal ethics and adherence to chivalric ideals. Some genuinely strove to live virtuously according to the standards of their time. But these standards were different from our modern moral expectations, and even the most honorable knights by medieval standards might shock us with behaviors we would consider deeply unethical today. The evening deepens as you sit in the great hall, watching younger knights boast of their exploits in the day's battle. One claims to have shown mercy to an enemy, allowing him to yield rather than delivering a killing blow. Very chivalrous. Another says, raising his cup in mock salute, "But his brother might kill you next time we fight. Then where will your mercy be?" The debate continues. Practical survival versus idealized behavior. You've seen enough battles to know that chivalry, like armor, is often discarded when it becomes too heavy to bear in the moment of truth. Chivalry wasn't a myth in the sense that it didn't exist at all. It did exist as an ideal and social convention. But it was far more limited, inconsistent, and class-specific than popular media portrays. It was an aspirational code at best, frequently ignored when convenient, and never intended to apply universally. The truly chivalrous knight of movies, the paragon of virtue who treats all people with respect and dignity regardless of their status, would have been viewed as dangerously naive by his real medieval counterparts. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, pragmatism typically won out over idealism. Not quite the romantic image we've inherited, but then again, real history rarely is. Tournaments. Now we're talking about the fun part of being a knight, right? Colorful banners snapping in the breeze, ladies swooning as their champions ride forth, the thrill of honorable competition, and the winner claiming a kiss from the local princess. It's like medieval NASCAR meets The Bachelor. Except, well, not quite. Real medieval tournaments did exist and were important social and training events for knights. But as with everything else we've discussed, the reality was considerably more brutal, chaotic, and less romantic than what we see on screen. Early tournaments, particularly from the 11th to 13th centuries, weren't the organized sporting events we imagine. They were closer to mass brawls, mock battles fought over large areas of countryside with few rules and dangerous outcomes. Knights would divide into teams and essentially wage war against each other across fields, forests, and sometimes even through villages. These early tournaments could last for days and cover several miles of territory. Injuries, common. Deaths, not unusual. Property damage, absolutely guaranteed. These events were so dangerous and disruptive that the church repeatedly tried to ban them, and several kings issued edicts against tournaments because they kept losing valuable knights to these supposedly friendly competitions. But wait, you say, what about jousting? That seems pretty organized and rule-based. True, by the 14th and 15th centuries, tournaments had evolved into more formalized events, with jousting becoming a centerpiece. But even then, it wasn't the romantic, relatively safe sport depicted in films. Let's talk about jousting for a minute. Two armored men on horseback charging at each other with solid wooden lances? Yeah, that's about as safe as it sounds, which is to say, not at all. Even with specialized jousting armor, which was significantly heavier and more restrictive than battlefield armor, the risks were enormous. Getting hit squarely by a lance, even one designed to break on impact, transferred tremendous force to the recipient. Broken bones, concussions, and internal injuries were common. Knights could be unhorsed and trampled, lances could splinter and penetrate eye slits or joints in armor, and horses could collide, crushing their riders' legs. Henry II of France died from a jousting accident in 1559 when a splinter from his opponent's lance penetrated his eye and entered his brain. That's right, even kings weren't immune to the dangers of this sport. The romantic image of giving a lady's favor, typically a scarf or sleeve, to wear into the joust, did have some basis in reality. But it wasn't always about love or admiration. Often these tokens represented political alliances or social networking. It was medieval virtue signaling, showing everyone whose team you were on. And those elaborate heralds announcing each knight with flowery descriptions of their lineage and accomplishments? They did exist, but their primary function was practical identification. When everyone's covered head to toe in metal, it's hard to tell who's who. Heralds and coat of arms served the same purpose as jersey numbers in modern sports, telling spectators and officials who just got clobbered. The prizes for tournament victories were indeed valuable, often money, horses, armor, or weapons. But they served a practical purpose beyond glory. Tournaments were expensive to participate in, requiring specialized equipment, travel expenses, entry fees, and more. Many knights relied on winnings to finance their continued participation in the tournament circuit. It was less about glory and more about making a living. How much for the ransom? You ask the knight who has just defeated you in the tournament melee. Your horse and armor would suffice, he replies, not unkindly but firmly. You sigh, knowing you'll have to go into debt to replace these items, but those are the stakes of tournament competition. Lose badly enough, and you might have to pawn your possessions or borrow money just to continue your career. Win consistently, and you might actually turn a profit. It was professional sports with very real financial consequences. Tournaments were also political events. They weren't held randomly for pure entertainment, but often marked significant occasions: marriages, births, treaties, or celebrations of military victories. Attendance wasn't just about athletic competition, but demonstrated political allegiance and social standing. Refusing an invitation to a tournament sponsored by your lord could be interpreted as an insult or even disloyalty. The pageantry we associate with tournaments, the colorful tents, elaborate costumes, feasting, and entertainment, did increase over time, particularly in the later medieval period. But even these elements had practical purposes beyond mere spectacle. They were opportunities for the nobility to display wealth and power, forge political alliances, arrange marriages, and conduct business away from the formality of court. For the knights themselves, tournaments presented a complex mix of opportunity and risk. Success could bring fame, wealth, and patronage. Failure could mean financial ruin, injury, or death. It was less follow your dreams, and more gamble your future on your ability to stay on a horse while someone tries to knock you off it with a stick. As night falls on the tournament grounds, you sit outside your modest tent, watching servants and squires bustle around the more elaborate encampments of wealthier knights. Your right shoulder throbs where you took a hard hit in today's joust, but you didn't break any bones this time. A small victory. Tomorrow brings the grand melee, the mock battle where teams of knights will fight on foot with blunted weapons. It's the event where you've had the most success in the past, though your aging body protests more with each passing year. A young squire approaches, eyes wide with admiration. Sir, is it true you once won the champion's purse at the Michaelmas tournament? You smile, remembering. Yes, though it was long ago. Use the winnings to buy this very armor and my best horse. I hope to compete in tournaments when I'm knighted, the boy says earnestly. You don't tell him about the constant pain, the mounting debts, the fellows you've seen carried off the field never to rise again. Let him keep his dreams a while longer. Reality will come soon enough. Tournaments, like everything else in a knight's life, were far less glamorous and far more dangerous than Hollywood would have us believe. They were professional sporting events with career implications, political minefields with social consequences, and physical competitions where the price of participation could be permanent injury or death. Just another day at the medieval office. The castle, not exactly a luxury resort. Castles feature prominently in night movies, grand stone fortresses with soaring towers, enormous great halls, and luxurious living quarters. The knight returns from battle to bathe in a copper tub before a roaring fire, then feasts on succulent meats while enjoying the entertainment of skilled musicians. The reality? Less five-star medieval resort, and more functional military installation with some uncomfortable living spaces tacked on. Let's start with the basic architecture and amenities. Yes, castles were made of stone, at least the later, more developed ones, but that doesn't mean they were comfortable. Stone retains cold and damp like nothing else. Imagine living inside a refrigerator that occasionally drips on you. That's winter in a medieval castle. Heating was provided by fireplaces, but medieval fireplaces were remarkably inefficient by modern standards. They projected as much smoke into the room as heat, particularly in windy conditions. The idea that every chamber had a cheerfully crackling fire keeping it toasty warm? Pure fantasy. Most rooms were unheated, and even heated chambers were rarely what we'd consider comfortable. "Can't we light a fire?" asks a visiting knight, shivering in the guest chamber you've provided. "Of course," you reply. "But I should warn you, the chimney in this room doesn't draw well. You'll have to choose between freezing or choking on smoke. Most choose to add another layer of clothing and suffer the cold." Windows? Few and small in early castles, as they represented structural weaknesses in defensive walls. Even in later castles with larger windows, glass was an expensive luxury. Most windows were covered with oiled parchment, wooden shutters, or simply left open to the elements. This meant that castle interiors were often dark, drafty, and exposed to whatever weather conditions prevailed outside. Privacy was virtually non-existent by modern standards. Even lords and ladies often slept in the great hall alongside their household members during earlier medieval periods. Later, as private chambers became more common for the nobility, these rooms were still regularly shared with servants or other family members. The idea of personal space was a concept that simply didn't exist as we understand it today. Sanitation was problematic. The garderobe toilet was typically a small chamber built into an exterior wall with a stone seat positioned over a vertical shaft that emptied outside the castle, often into the moat or onto the ground below. Imagine a cold stone toilet seat in the middle of winter, with a draft coming up from below. Toilet paper? Moss, leaves, or a communal cloth served the purpose. Water had to be carried from wells or nearby sources, meaning that bathing was an occasional luxury rather than a daily routine. The idea of private bathrooms with running water would have seemed like witchcraft to medieval castle dwellers. When baths did occur, they often involved multiple people using the same water in sequence based on social rank, with the water getting progressively dirtier with each user. Now, about those luxurious feasts we see in movies. While special occasions certainly featured elaborate meals for the nobility, daily fare was far more monotonous. Food preservation was limited to smoking, salting, pickling, or drying. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and often considered less desirable than meat. Refrigeration didn't exist, so meat that wasn't consumed quickly would spoil, especially in warmer months. Spices were used liberally by the wealthy, not just for flavor, but often to mask the taste of meat that was, shall we say, past its prime. The image of knights dining on fresh, succulent roasts daily. Another Hollywood fabrication. More likely they consumed a lot of bread, preserved meats, pottages, thick stews, and ale or wine. The latter often consumed in place of water due to contamination concerns. Entertainment existed, but wasn't the constant diversion depicted in films. Musicians, storytellers, and other performers were primarily features of special occasions or larger household establishments. Day-to-day life in a castle involved considerably more boredom and routine tasks than exciting diversions. "What shall we do this evening?" asks your wife as yet another winter night stretches before you. You consider the options, listen to the same harper play, the same songs you've heard 100 times, play chess, again, or simply go to bed early to conserve candles and firewood. "Perhaps the chaplain could read to us," you suggest, knowing that even religious texts become welcome entertainment when alternatives are scarce. The living arrangements within castles reflected strict social hierarchies. Knights weren't necessarily at the top of this structure. A household knight might have accommodations barely better than servants, particularly if he wasn't from a wealthy family. Only knights who were also lords of their own estates would enjoy the better rooms and amenities a castle had to offer. Castles were also perpetually under construction or repair. The image of the perfect, complete castle is largely a modern invention. Medieval castles were constantly evolving structures, with sections being added, modified, or rebuilt as needs changed and damages occurred. Living with construction noise, dust, and disruption was simply part of castle life. During peacetime, castles functioned as administrative centers, with much of the daily activity revolving around the management of surrounding estates. This meant that, rather than heroic deeds and entertaining diversions, much of a castle-dwelling knight's time might be occupied with decidedly unheroic tasks, reviewing accounts, settling tenant disputes, or overseeing agricultural activities. When war or siege threatened, castles transformed from merely uncomfortable living spaces to downright unpleasant ones. Additional people, soldiers, nearby villagers seeking protection, and their livestock, would crowd inside, straining sanitation, food supplies, and patience. The romantic notion of heroically defending castle walls quickly gave way to the reality of overcrowding, disease, dwindling supplies, and the constant fear of starvation or successful enemy assault. As you climb the narrow, winding staircase to your chamber, the steps worn from centuries of use, you reflect on how different your daily reality is from the tales your own father told you when you were a child. The glamour of knighthood exists primarily in stories and songs, not in the cold, damp stone surrounding you, or the persistent smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and human waste that pervades even the finest castles. Your chamber, though better than most due to your status, is Spartan by any modern standard. A bed with straw mattress covered by wool blankets, a simple chest for your possessions, a small table, and perhaps a chair or stool. The walls might have a tapestry, not primarily for decoration, but to help insulate against the cold radiating from the stone. As you settle in for the night, blowing out the expensive tallow candle to save what remains, darkness engulfs you completely. No ambient light from street lamps, no glowing electronic devices, just absolute darkness and the distant sounds of the castle settling around you. This is the reality of castle life for a knight. Functional, hierarchical, often uncomfortable, and far from the romantic ideal portrayed in films. It served its purpose as a defensive structure with living accommodations as a secondary consideration. Comfort, privacy, and convenience were concepts that would have to wait for future centuries to be fully developed. Ah, love, every knight movie needs a romance, right? Our hero knight falls passionately in love with a beautiful noblewoman, or occasionally, to show his democratic spirit, a beautiful peasant woman. They exchange longing glances across crowded halls, share stolen moments in castle gardens, and eventually overcome all obstacles, family disapproval, rival suitors, wars, etc., to marry and live happily ever after. Medieval reality check. Marriage was a business transaction. Love was often considered a form of temporary insanity. and happy endings were as rare as dragons. For knights and nobility, marriage was primarily about forging alliances, securing or expanding landholdings, and producing legitimate heirs. Romantic attraction wasn't irrelevant, but it ranked far, far below practical considerations like dowry size, family connections, and political advantage. But what of love? The young knight asks his older mentor, his voice earnest. The older man laughs, not unkindly. Love is for troubadours' songs and courtly games. Marriage is for land, alliances, and heirs. Learn the difference quickly, or you'll find yourself landless and powerless, no matter how happy your heart. Marriage negotiations were conducted like business deals, because they were business deals. Families might spend months or years negotiating the terms, how much land or money would come with the bride, what claims might be established through the union, even details about how many servants the bride could bring or what would happen to her property if she died childless. The bride and groom themselves, often peripheral to these negotiations. While their consent was technically required by church law, the reality of family pressure, financial dependence, and social expectations meant that refusing a match your family had arranged could have severe consequences. Age differences between spouses could be substantial. Men typically married in their mid to late 20s or even 30s, having established themselves financially and professionally. Women, on the other hand, might be married as young as 12 or 14, though more commonly in their mid to late teens. A knight in his 30s marrying a teenage girl was completely normal by medieval standards, though we'd consider it inappropriate today. Once married, the primary duty of noble couples was clear: produce heirs, preferably male ones. Failure to conceive children could be grounds for annulment. The pressure on women in particular was intense. Their value was largely measured by their fertility and ability to produce healthy sons. Childbed was dangerous territory. Many women died in childbirth or from subsequent infections. Those who survived often went through this perilous process repeatedly throughout their fertile years. It wasn't uncommon for a knight to have multiple wives over his lifetime, not due to divorce, but because of maternal mortality. My lord husband has been married 3 times before me, confides a young noblewoman to her lady-in-waiting. All died bringing his children into the world. I pray nightly that I will survive to see my children grown. Her fear is justified. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of all social classes, with maternal mortality rates estimated at 1 to 2% per birth. With multiple pregnancies throughout a woman's life, the cumulative risk was substantial. But what about all that courtly love and romance we associate with knights? Didn't knights write poetry to their ladies and wear their favors into battle? Well, yes and no. Courtly love did exist as a cultural practice, particularly from the 12th century onward. But, and this is important, it was usually not directed toward one's own spouse. The typical object of a knight's courtly devotion was an unattainable woman, often his lord's wife or another married noble woman. The unattainability was a feature, not a bug, of the system. This form of love was highly stylized, involving elaborate rituals of devotion, poetry, and service, all while remaining theoretically chaste, though in practice, affairs certainly happened. It was more of a social game and literary convention than a basis for actual relationships. Think of it as medieval reality TV, dramatic, performative, and only loosely connected to reality. Marriage, meanwhile, continued to function primarily as a practical arrangement. Spouses might develop genuine affection over time, but this was considered a happy bonus rather than an expectation. Marriages weren't about personal fulfillment or romantic love. They were about preserving and enhancing family power, property, and bloodlines. For knights without significant property or status, household knights attached to a lord's service, for instance, marriage options were more limited, but still governed by practical considerations rather than romantic ones. They might marry women from prosperous merchant families trading wealth for status, or form alliances with other military families to strengthen their position. The lowest-ranked knights might have somewhat more freedom in choosing spouses, simply because they had less property and power at stake. But even then, practical considerations of dowry and family connections typically outweighed romantic sentiment. Did happy, loving marriages exist in medieval times? Certainly, human nature hasn't changed that dramatically over the centuries. Historical records and letters show examples of genuine affection and devotion between spouses. But these were fortunate outcomes within a system designed primarily for economic and political purposes, not the foundational expectation of marriage that we have today. As you sit across from your wife at the evening meal, watching her direct servants and manage household affairs with quiet efficiency, you reflect on the arrangement that brought you together 15 years ago. The marriage was negotiated by your fathers, her dowry lands connected perfectly with your eastern holdings, creating a more defensible border. You barely knew each other on your wedding day. Yet time has forged something neither of you expected, not the burning passion of minstrels' tales, but a steady, reliable partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. You've buried 3 children together and raised 4 more. You've weathered sieges, poor harvests, and political upheavals side by side. Is it love? Not as the romantic tales define it. But it's something perhaps more durable, a bond forged through shared suffering and triumph, through duty fulfilled and challenges overcome together. Not the stuff of epic poems, perhaps, but real in a way that courtly fantasy never could be. This was the reality of marriage for medieval knights. Practical arrangements that might, with luck and effort, develop into genuine partnerships. The Hollywood vision of knights swept away by passionate love, defying family and society for romance, about as historically accurate as dragons and wizards. In the movies, veteran knights typically meet one of 2 fates: a glorious death in battle, complete with moving final speech, or a peaceful retirement to their estates, where they dispense wisdom to younger knights and live out their days in respected comfort, perhaps training the next generation. Medieval reality offered less appealing options. First, let's talk about life expectancy. While it's a myth that everyone in the medieval period died by 40, it's true that reaching old age was less common than today. For knights, who literally made their living through violence and physical prowess, the odds of reaching what we'd consider retirement age were particularly slim. Many knights died young from the obvious causes: battle wounds, tournament injuries, or infections resulting from those injuries. Those who survived these immediate dangers still faced the accumulated toll of a physically punishing lifestyle. By their 40s or 50s, most knights were dealing with chronic pain from old injuries, limited mobility, and declining strength, not ideal for a profession based on physical combat. "Everything hurts," grumbles an older knight as he struggles to mount his horse. "My back, my knees, my shoulders, all the places I've been hit, stabbed, or fallen on over 30 years of service." His squire helps boost him into the saddle, pretending not to notice the grimace of pain or how much assistance his once formidable master now requires. Unlike modern professionals with 401ks and pension plans, medieval knights had no formal retirement system. There was no magical age at which you could turn in your sword and armor and start collecting monthly payments. For knights who were also landholders, aging meant gradually shifting from active military service to estate management, still working, just in a less physically demanding role. But what about knights who weren't major landholders? Household knights who served a lord directly faced particularly difficult prospects as they aged. Their value was directly tied to their fighting ability. As that declined, so did their usefulness and status. Some were kept on out of loyalty or given less demanding positions within the household, but others were simply replaced by younger, more capable fighters. Many aging knights faced financial insecurity. The expenses of maintaining knightly status, armor, weapons, horses, appropriate clothing, and accommodations, didn't diminish with age, but the ability to earn through military service or tournament victories did. Knights without substantial family wealth or successful careers could find themselves downwardly mobile, struggling to maintain their status or even slipping into poverty. Physical disability from combat or tournament injuries could accelerate this decline. A knight who lost the use of an arm or leg or suffered debilitating head injuries, common in an era of repeated concussions without treatment, might find himself unable to continue his profession long before old age. Disability accommodations were rudimentary at best, and the concept of disability benefits simply didn't exist. Some aging knights sought refuge in religious orders, particularly military orders like the Knights Templar or Hospitaller, which could provide community and basic needs in exchange for service appropriate to one's abilities. This option became especially attractive to widowed or never-married knights without family support systems. For the majority who remained in secular society, family was the primary safety net. Knights with adult children who had established their own positions might be supported by the next generation. This created additional pressure to produce and raise successful heirs. Your children weren't just the continuation of your lineage. They were potentially your retirement plan. The idealized image of the respected elder knight training youngsters in the art of combat did occur, but it wasn't the norm. Age and experience were valued, but medieval society was generally less sentimental about aging than our own. An aging knight with diminished capabilities was often viewed with pity rather than reverence. I remember when Sir Robert could take on 5 men at once. One young knight whispers to another as they watch an elderly man struggle through a basic training exercise with squires. "Now look at him. We'll all be there someday," his companion replies, "if we're lucky enough to live that long." The most fortunate aging knights were those who had successfully diversified their roles throughout their careers. Those who had diplomatic skills, administrative experience, or strategic knowledge that remained valuable even as their physical prowess declined. These knights might transition to advisory positions, diplomatic missions, or governance roles. But for many, the twilight years brought a painful loss of identity and purpose. Having defined themselves through martial prowess for decades, the inevitable physical decline of aging could trigger what we would now recognize as depression or existential crisis. The medieval world offered few resources for dealing with these psychological challenges. Death, when it came, was rarely as dramatic or meaningful as Hollywood portrays. While some knights did die in battle, many more succumbed to disease, infections, or age-related ailments. Medieval medicine had little to offer for cancer, heart disease, or stroke. Pain management was primitive, consisting mainly of alcohol, herbal preparations of varying effectiveness, and opiates for the wealthy. As you lie in your bed, bones aching from decades of hard use, you listen to the rain drumming on the roof and contemplate your legacy. Your eldest son manages most estate affairs now. Your fighting days are long past. The famous sword that once felt like an extension of your arm now seems impossibly heavy. Your squire, your last squire, helps you sit up and brings a cup of watered wine. He's not really a squire anymore, but something between a servant and a nurse to your aging body. "Shall I send for the priest?" he asks gently. "You've been coughing blood for 3 days now." You nod, knowing what it means. Not the glorious death you imagined in your youth, struck down in battle defending your lord or some noble cause. Just an old man's ending, witnessed by a handful of household members rather than an army or a kingdom. This was the reality for most aging knights. A gradual decline rather than a dramatic final chapter. A quiet fading rather than a blaze of glory. There was no retirement ceremony, gold watch, or pension. Just the slow realization that the skills that defined your life were slipping away, and society had limited use for what remained. Not quite the heroic third act that medieval movies tend to portray, but then again, reality rarely matches our preferred narratives. Just as the beginning and middle of a knight's life were far less glamorous than fiction suggests, so too was the end. As we've journeyed through the unglamorous reality of knighthood, from the torturous armor and brutal training to the pragmatic marriages and difficult aging, a picture emerges that's radically different from the Hollywood version we've all grown up with. The real medieval knight wasn't primarily a shining hero on a noble quest. He was a professional fighter navigating a dangerous world with the tools, values, and understanding available to him. He was a product of his time, sometimes courageous, sometimes cruel, bound by social expectations and practical necessities that modern audiences would find alien or even horrifying. The armor wasn't shining, it was functional, uncomfortable, and perpetually in need of maintenance. The training wasn't a motivational montage, but years of grueling, dangerous preparation that began in childhood. Battles weren't choreographed dances, but chaotic, terrifying experiences where survival often came down to luck as much as skill. Chivalry existed, but was applied selectively and pragmatically rather than as a universal moral code. Tournaments were professional sporting events with real financial and physical stakes, not mere pageantry. Castles were functional military installations where comfort took a distant second place to defense. Love and marriage operated under different rules, with romantic attachment considered secondary to practical concerns of alliance, property, and lineage. And when a knight's fighting days ended, there was no glorious retirement, just the challenge of maintaining relevance and support in a society that valued martial prowess above almost all else. Why do we cling to the romanticized version? Perhaps because the reality is too distant from our modern sensibilities, too complex and morally ambiguous for simple storytelling, or perhaps because humans have always needed heroes, figures who represent our ideals rather than our realities. The mythologizing of knights began not with modern movies, but in their own time, with the romantic literature and chansons de geste that portrayed knights as larger-than-life heroes rather than the complicated, flawed professionals they actually were. We've simply continued and expanded this tradition with our modern storytelling. As you drift between sleeping and waking, memories of your life as a knight shifting like shadows in your mind, you wonder how you'll be remembered. Will the local minstrel compose songs about your most successful battle, conveniently omitting the fear, the chaos, the moments when luck rather than skill saved you? Will they mention the peasant village you helped burn during that campaign in your lord's service, or just the time you rescued a nobleman's son from enemy captivity? History has a way of smoothing rough edges, of transforming complicated people into simple archetypes. Perhaps it's better that way. Perhaps the ideal of knighthood, courage, loyalty, skill in arms used in service of worthy causes, deserves to survive even if the messy reality is forgotten. In the end, the knight of Hollywood and the knight of history share one fundamental quality. Both are human responses to the chaos and danger of their worlds. The movie knight faces this chaos with impossible virtue and skill, never losing his moral compass or perfect hair. The historical knight confronted it with whatever tools and understanding his time and place afforded him, often falling short of the ideal, but sometimes, remarkably, coming close. As we enjoy our knights in shining armor on screen, perhaps we can appreciate both the appealing myth and the complex reality behind it. The actual men who lived, fought, loved, and died according to the values and necessities of their time, not ours. Their story may be less satisfying than the Hollywood version, but it has its own gritty truth, that humans in every age do what they must with what they have, sometimes achieving moments of genuine courage and honor even amid the mud, blood, and imperfection of real life. And that, perhaps, is the most heroic thing of all. Sleep claims you at last, old knight. Not all legends are true, but all contain some truth. Rest well.